They used to laugh when they said it. Be your sister's free nanny, you're good with kids. And I laughed too at first. Back then, laughter still meant something light. It didn't yet carry the weight of humiliation dressed as humor. I was 31, recently between jobs, when my sister Claire called. She needed help just for a few months after her second child was born. She sounded tired, desperate in a way that made me say yes before I thought twice. Family, I told myself, doesn't ask for proof of worth. Family trusts. Her house smelled of lavender and exhaustion. Toys scattered across the living room like confetti after a party no one cleaned up. Claire hugged me quickly, said, "You're a lifesaver," and handed me the baby monitor before I'd even taken off my coat. At first, I didn't mind. I cooked, cleaned bottles, read bedtime stories, stayed up when the baby had fevers. I told myself it was temporary. But months became a year, and every time I hinted about returning to work, Claire would smile and say, "You can't put a price on family help." I remember one afternoon when her friends were over, sipping wine on the patio. I was folding laundry by the open door, the wind carrying their laughter. "Imagine paying your own sister," one of them joked. Claire laughed. That careless, ringing sound that used to make me proud when we were children. "She doesn't mind," she said. "She loves the kids." They all laughed then, the kind of laughter that draws lines instead of bridging them. I kept folding, slower now, each crease sharper than the last. If you've ever been laughed at while serving someone who owes you gratitude, tell me where you're listening from, because you'll understand how silence feels heavier than noise. The next day, I asked if she could start looking for a daycare option, just part-time. She looked at me like I'd spoken in another language. "Daycare? Why would we pay strangers when you're here? Your family." That word again, family. It sounded different now, less like love, more like a leash. As time stretched, I noticed small changes. My name faded from invitations, replaced by the aunt. My belongings, which I kept in the guest room, began to feel like clutter. When I tried to set boundaries, Claire would tilt her head and say, "You're so ungrateful. We let you stay rent-free." Stay? The word echoed. I hadn't realized I was staying. I thought I was helping. One evening, I overheard her and her husband in the kitchen. "She'll never leave," he said. "She can't afford to," Claire replied. "We've done her a favor." I stood in the hallway, holding the folded blanket I'd meant to put over her son. Something inside me shifted. Not anger yet, but the slow, measured birth of awareness. That night I couldn't sleep. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the baby's breathing on the monitor. I looked around the dimly lit guest room, the laundry basket, the unpaid bills with my handwriting, the planner filled with their errands. My life had been written in someone else's margins. In the morning, I found a small notebook and wrote the date. Then I wrote the hours, 7 a.m., 9 p.m. Childcare, cooking, cleaning. No salary, no recognition. Just family. I didn't know why I started writing it down. Maybe to remind myself I existed. Maybe to prove that what I gave had weight. Weeks passed. My notebook filled quietly, line after line. On the outside, nothing changed. I smiled, I served, I stayed. But inside, something was gathering. Slow, deliberate, and certain. One night, after everyone had gone to sleep, I sat on the porch under the dull light and looked at the notebook. My handwriting looked different now, steadier, firmer. I realized then that I wasn't keeping a diary. I was keeping evidence, and though I didn't know it yet, that evidence would one day silence every laugh that had ever tried to shrink me. The notebook became my shadow. I kept it close, hidden in the drawer beneath the towels, wrapped in an old scarf. Every day, the pages filled with numbers that didn't seem like much. Breakfast at 7, dishes by 8, errands before noon. But each line was a quiet confession of how much of my life was being traded for someone else's comfort. It started as habit, then became ritual. The ink stains on my fingers felt like proof of existence, the kind that couldn't be laughed away. I wrote everything. Bottles washed, diapers changed, meals prepared, hours spent soothing tantrums that weren't mine to calm. I even began noting the weather. Gray skies, soft rain, humid mornings. Because when your life becomes invisible, you start recording the world just to remember you were in it. Claire never noticed. Or maybe she did and chose not to see. She had a talent for selective blindness, especially when the truth was inconvenient. Her husband, Evan, was worse. He treated me like the furniture that cleaned itself. Some evenings he'd toss his keys onto the counter and say, "You really should be grateful. Not many people get free lodging these days." I'd smile, but only because silence was stronger than arguing. Words wasted on people who believe kindness is charity always echo back empty. There was one afternoon when Claire's friend, Marianne, dropped by with gifts for the children. I served them tea as usual and stayed in the kitchen washing cups while they spoke. Marianne's voice carried easily. "You're so lucky to have her," she said. "I'd go mad with 2 kids and no help," Claire laughed. "Oh, she's family. She doesn't count as help." Something in that sentence, "she doesn't count," struck like a match in a dark room. I didn't stop washing, didn't look up, but I felt something inside me ignite quietly, without flame, without smoke. I dried the cups carefully and went upstairs, closing the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the notebook. Beneath the hours, I added a new line in the margin, "I count." That night, when everyone was asleep, I went online. I searched for domestic labor laws, unpaid caregiving, family exploitation. Words like documentation, compensation, and intent appeared again and again. The more I read, the more I realized how many people had stories like mine. Women who gave everything in the name of love and were repaid with invisibility. I began printing articles, highlighting paragraphs, organizing them in a folder I labeled Household Notes. A small deception, easily dismissed if discovered. Claire never questioned it. She assumed anything with paperwork was beneath her attention. Weeks became months, and the folder grew thicker. My notebook now had a twin, the one with evidence too sharp for laughter. I started taking photos of receipts, tracking grocery lists, logging every message where Claire reminded me of my role. I didn't know what I was building. Not yet. But I knew it was solid. The day the children's school called for an emergency pickup, I was the one who went. Claire was at a spa, Evan at a meeting. The principal handed me the forms to sign, but when I wrote my name, she frowned. "You're not listed as guardian," she said gently. "I'm afraid we can't release them to you without confirmation." That pause, that moment of being denied even the right to act as caretaker after years of service, burned deeper than any insult. I waited outside in the hallway, hearing my nephew cry, until Claire arrived half an hour later, irritated, accusing me of overreacting. "Why didn't you just call me?" she said. "I did," I replied. "You didn't answer," she rolled her eyes. "You worry too much. It's not that serious." But it was. It was everything. That evening, I added one more line to my notes. Not even listed. Not even real. Then in the margin, yet they call it family. The next morning, I took the folder with me when I went for groceries and made a stop at the small law firm near the market. The nameplate on the door said, M. Hale, Attorney. I hesitated before knocking, uncertain of what I'd even say. The receptionist glanced up. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said, "but I think I need one." When I met Mr. Hale that afternoon, he listened more than he spoke. His office smelled faintly of paper and lemon polish. I laid the folder on his desk, my hand steady despite the tremor in my chest. He flipped through the pages, eyes narrowing slightly as he read. "This is detailed," he said finally. "How long have you been documenting?" "Almost 2 years." He looked up at me then, not with pity, but with respect. "You've done more work than half the cases I see fully prepared. If what you're saying is accurate, you may have grounds for compensation." "From family?" I asked quietly. He nodded once. "Family doesn't erase labor." Those words stayed with me long after I left his office. Family doesn't erase labor. They repeated in my head that night while I folded laundry and listened to Claire complain about her day. I said nothing, but the silence felt different now, denser, sharper, alive. I had begun as a shadow in my own story, but with every word written, every page filled, I was taking shape again. I didn't know how long it would take, or how much it would cost, but for the first time in years, I felt the edge of something real. Proof, purpose, and the faint hum of justice waiting patiently in the dark. The days following that meeting felt both endless and deliberate. Each morning, I still rose before the sun, made breakfast, packed lunches, and tied shoelaces. Nothing changed on the surface. That was the point. The house remained my stage. my every movement rehearsed in silence, but beneath it, something invisible had begun shifting, an undercurrent of intention threading through the monotony. Mr. Hale had given me forms to complete, declarations of hours, witness statements, proof of responsibility. Each night, after the children were asleep, I sat by the window and filled them in, tracing truth with the precision of someone who had learned patience through years of dismissal. The city lights outside blurred through the glass, and I realized how much time I'd spent watching life from the other side of a window. One afternoon, Claire asked why I was smiling to myself while folding clothes. "You look like you're hiding something," she teased, half curious, half condescending. I looked up, calm as a still lake. "Maybe I am," I said. She laughed and went back to scrolling her phone, unaware that for once, her mockery was the truest thing she'd ever said. The following week, I met Mr. Hale again. He'd begun assembling my case quietly, relying on the evidence I'd kept so meticulously. "You've built a strong record," he said, sliding copies of my notes across the desk. "The law sees labor, even when family pretends not to." His words had weight. They didn't ignite anger. They steadied resolve. Still, part of me hesitated. I wasn't driven by vengeance. It wasn't about punishing them. It was about acknowledgement, about drawing a line between love and labor, so that one would never erase the other again. "If we do this," I asked, "will they know right away?" He nodded. "A summons has to be delivered. Once that happens, you can't go back to pretending nothing happened." I sat in silence for a moment. Pretending had been my whole existence for years. Pretending I was fine, pretending the laughter didn't sting, pretending servitude was affection. I exhaled and said, "Then let it end." When the papers were filed, time seemed to slow. The summons was sent by registered post. I didn't see them open it, but I heard the echo of it that evening. Claire's voice carried through the hallway, sharp and disbelieving. "She's suing us? Her own family? This is insane!" Her husband's tone was colder. "She can't do this. It's family work. There's no contract." "There doesn't have to be," I said, stepping into the doorway. The silence that followed felt like stepping onto new ground. Claire stared at me, her face pale with shock. "You can't be serious." "I was never joking," I said. "You were." She laughed once, disbelieving, brittle. "You won't win. You'll just embarrass yourself." I smiled faintly. "We'll see." After that, the air in the house changed. Conversation became mechanical, meals brief. Even the children sensed it, the tension that hummed beneath each polite exchange. I continued my duties as before, but now every gesture was deliberate, every task a statement of control. It was strange, how power could exist in the smallest acts. Pouring tea, tying a ribbon, setting a plate. A week later, Mr. Hale called. "The hearing date is confirmed," he said. 2 months from now. 2 months. 60 days to live among people who believed they owned my silence. In that time, the laughter stopped. The friends who once joked about my unpaid devotion now spoke in whispers when I passed by. Claire avoided eye contact. Evan spent longer hours away. The house was quieter than it had ever been. Not out of peace, but out of fear. The kind of fear born from finally being seen. One evening after dinner, Claire approached me in the kitchen. Her voice was small, almost human. "Why are you doing this? We're family." I dried my hands slowly. "You're right," I said. "And family should know better." She blinked, tears threatening, but never falling. "If you needed money, you could have just asked." I shook my head. "It's not about money. It's about value." She turned away, muttering something I didn't catch, then left me alone with the sound of the clock ticking. That night, I wrote only one sentence in my notebook. They finally heard the silence. As the hearing drew closer, the house grew heavier with anticipation. I still woke early, still moved through the routines I had once mistaken for belonging. But each act now felt like closure. Folding the last shirt, cooking the last meal, cleaning the last plate before departure. On the morning before the hearing, I looked around the living room one final time. The toys, the framed photos, the faint scent of vanilla candles. It all felt strangely distant, as if I were observing a life that had once been mine, but never truly was. When I left for the courthouse, The air outside was sharp, almost metallic with the scent of rain. I carried my folder close to my chest, not with fear, but with calm precision. The laughter that had followed me for years had gone quiet now. And as I stepped into the building, the echo of my footsteps felt like the beginning of a different kind of sound, one that demanded to be heard. The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and paper, the kind of scent that only exists in places where truth is measured by signatures. My shoes echoed softly across the tiled floor as I followed Mr. Hale down the corridor. The walls were lined with old portraits, faces of people who once believed justice could be captured in paint. I clutched my folder tighter, the edges digging into my palms like quiet reminders that this was real now. Inside the courtroom, light filtered through high windows, pale and unforgiving. Claire sat at the opposite table, her posture perfect, her face carefully composed. Evan sat beside her, jaw tight, eyes hard. Their lawyer leaned toward them, whispering something meant to reassure. But I saw the flicker of worry behind his professionalism. There's a kind of tension that no legal training can mask. It's the weight of underestimating someone for too long. Mr. Hale placed a gentle hand on my shoulder before we began. "Remember," he said quietly, "truth doesn't need volume. It just needs consistency." I nodded, my throat dry but steady. The judge entered and everyone rose. The air felt thick, charged with unspoken history. The opening statements were civil at first, almost polite. Claire's lawyer described me as a kind-hearted sister who had volunteered to help during a difficult time, insisting there was no agreement, no expectation of payment. I listened without interruption, my gaze fixed on the grain of the wooden table. Every lie, every twist of language felt predictable. They had spent their lives practicing this kind of manipulation, dressing exploitation in warmth and calling it family. When it was our turn, Mr. Hale's voice carried a calm precision that filled the room without force. "This case," he began, "is not about bitterness. It's about acknowledgement. The plaintiff did not seek payment for love. She seeks recognition for labor that has been both demanded and dismissed." He handed the judge the first stack of documents, my notes. Each page was dated, timed, and cross-referenced with text messages and grocery receipts. The sound of the paper sliding across the table echoed louder than any voice in the room. Claire shifted in her seat, her composure faltering for the first time. Then came the photos. Me holding the children at doctor's appointments, my handwriting on school forms, signatures confirming pickups, meal plans, medical records. Mr. Hale placed each piece with deliberate care, as if assembling the puzzle of invisibility that had defined my life for 2 years. Claire's lawyer objected, claiming emotional manipulation. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Facts are not emotions, counselor," she said evenly. The words landed like the first crack in a wall. When I was called to speak, I stood slowly. The courtroom blurred at the edges. The hum of the fluorescent lights filled the silence between breaths. I told them what had happened, not with anger, but with the steady clarity of someone who had already lived the worst of it. I spoke of the mornings that began before dawn, the laughter that cut deeper than insults, the quiet way my name had been erased from their world. Claire's gaze met mine once, defiant and afraid all at once. "You could have just said no," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I did," I said. "Every day you ignored it." The judge listened without expression, but her pen never stopped moving. When I finished, the silence in the room was dense, almost physical. Even the sound of paper shuffling seemed hesitant, as if afraid to break it. Then Mr. Hale presented the final piece of evidence, the employment clause Claire had unknowingly signed. It was a simple form, buried among school registration documents, confirming me as the children's caregiver until formal replacement. Her own handwriting, her own date. The irony was perfect and cruel. Claire's lawyer went pale. Evan muttered something under his breath. The judge leaned forward. "So this was signed by the defendant?" Mr. Hale nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. It fulfills all criteria of implied employment. Compensation, therefore, is both reasonable and lawful." For a moment, no one spoke. The tension broke not with noise, but with stillness. Even Claire's breathing seemed to stop. The courtroom had gone utterly, perfectly silent. The judge looked at me then, her expression softened by something almost human beneath the authority. "You've been patient," she said quietly. "The law rewards patience when it's supported by truth." She ruled in my favor. The sound of the gavel was both soft and final, like a door closing behind years of dismissal. I didn't smile. I just exhaled, slow and controlled, feeling the weight leave my shoulders one breath at a time. Claire sat frozen, eyes wide but empty, her laughter from all those years echoing faintly in the space between us. When the session ended, I gathered my folder and turned to leave. As I passed their table, I paused, not to gloat, but to look. Claire's hands trembled on the edge of her chair. Evan's jaw clenched, the way people do when reality refuses to bend. I said nothing. Justice doesn't need applause. Outside, the air felt sharper, cleaner. The city noise washed over me like a wave I'd finally learned to float on. I walked slowly down the courthouse steps, sunlight breaking through thin clouds, touching the ground like a quiet benediction. It wasn't victory I felt, it was recognition. And in that moment, that was enough. The days after the verdict passed quietly, like a tide that had gone out and left the shore clean. I packed my things slowly, not with haste or bitterness, but with the calm of someone who had finally reclaimed time. The house was still. The same rooms, the same laughter faintly echoing from old memories. But it no longer belonged to that version of me who once folded their clothes and waited for gratitude that never came. I had no anger left, only stillness. Claire didn't call. She sent a message through her lawyer. A few cold sentences about repayment terms and property division. It didn't matter anymore. Justice, once delivered, stops asking for acknowledgement. I deleted the message and watched the screen fade to black, its reflection catching my face for a second. Familiar, but steadier now. That afternoon, I visited Mr. Hale's office to finalize the closure documents. He looked up as I entered, a quiet satisfaction in his eyes. "You've done something rare," he said. "Most people never stay composed long enough to let truth win." "I didn't stay composed," I replied softly. "I stayed tired. That's what patience really is." He smiled at that. "So what will you do now?" I thought for a moment. "Rest," I said, "and then begin again." Outside, the air carried a faint salt scent. I'd already chosen where I would go, a small coastal town 2 hours away. I'd visited it once years ago, back when I still believed helping people would protect me from loneliness. The sea had felt endless then, but kind. I wanted to remember that feeling again. By evening, I was driving out of the city, the highway unfolding beneath the muted sky. The buildings thinned, the traffic faded, and the landscape widened until silence became part of the horizon. I rolled the window down, letting wind move through my hair, the taste of rain lingering on the air. The folder with my documents sat beside me on the passenger seat, closed, complete, unnecessary now. When I arrived at the coast, the sky was deep gold. The sea stretched out flat and shining, like something eternal and forgiving. I parked by the dunes and walked toward the shore. My shoes sank slightly in the damp sand, the rhythm of the waves syncing with my steps. I stood there for a long time, not thinking, just breathing. For the first time in years, I wasn't counting hours. The wind carried voices from far off. Children playing, the faint hum of a cafe somewhere up the road. But they sounded distant, harmless, like echoes from another life. I took the notebook from my bag, the one that had started everything, and opened to the first page. The ink had faded slightly, but the lines were still clear. Dates, hours, chores, proof. I ran my fingers across them and smiled. This had once been evidence. Now it was just a record of endurance. I tore the first page out and let it go. The paper fluttered once, then vanished into the water, its edges dissolving almost instantly. I watched until the sea carried it beyond sight. Then I closed the notebook and placed it back in my bag. Lighter somehow. The next morning, I found a small cottage for rent. White walls, blue shutters, a view of the water. The landlord, an old woman with soft eyes, handed me the keys and said, "The wind gets loud here at night, but you'll get used to it." I smiled and said, "I think I already have." In the evenings, I wrote again, not records this time, but reflections. Small pieces of thought, fragments of peace. Some were about Claire, some about forgiveness, most about nothing at all. Writing felt different now. It wasn't survival, it was clarity. Sometimes I wondered if they ever thought about me. The courtroom, the silence, the moment the laughter ended. But wondering didn't hurt anymore. Some truths don't need remembering. They just need to stay known. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the horizon, I stood at the porch watching the sea turn from gold to violet. The waves moved endlessly, repeating but never returning the same. I whispered into the wind, not as a wish or farewell, but as a quiet understanding. Family doesn't define peace, I said. Choice does. The words disappeared into the salt air, carried somewhere I didn't need to follow. Inside, the light from the lamp spilled across the table, warm and patient. I locked the door gently, the sound soft and certain. For once, the silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt earned.